And I could walk into the New York Times building, then any office that I wanted to check out or see an editor. I didn't even have to make an appointment or anything. I keep going back to New York, and it amazes me the security that many public buildings have. And when I'm on this point, going back to New York City, it amazes me that some blocks, some aspects have not changed at all in 60 years. This is almost incomprehensible. While other blocks and streets and sections, unrecognizable, would not have anticipated.
You raised many wonderful points. The drug war as opposed to dope, whether that's what's responsible for this.
Yeah, I believe that's true.
Yeah, there's a cause and effect problem there.
A war as victim.
Anyone else before we close? Okay, over there.
I'd just like to go back to the
Louder.
I'd just like to go back to the fear thing, if I could, which Mr. Brin was talking about, that as long as the fear level remains below a certain threshold, we tend not to rank ourselves. And then you can make a remark that if the fear level goes too low, that maybe one little tap might sort of push things over. I would say that's not going to happen, because when people have obvious things to fear, they tend to imagine them.
Oh, yes.
Everyone seems to have this attitude where things go well, and everyone has had this happen to them. Sometimes things go really, really well in your life for like 2 weeks. You sit there and say, okay, when am I going to do?
X-Files is a
That's right.
reflection of this.
Yeah, X-Files after the Cold War. I mean, the Cold War. Look at all the things we're worried about.
Our threat
We're not
was-
worried about that anymore.
And people who were loyal to the United States when there was a threat of the Soviet Union suddenly look at the United States of America as being the great enemy,
Yeah.
the great Satan, here within our country, largely because of the propaganda campaign, by the way, of which I approve and I am a product. The suspicion of authority propaganda campaign, I totally agree with. Duh, I was raised on it, excuse me. And I promote it in my books. But I think it's time for us to at least notice the most relentless propaganda campaign the world has ever seen. Far greater than Goebbels and Stalin combined. And we only don't notice it because A, we already agree with it, and B, because it feeds our egos, because we tend to think, I am the individualist around here, you're all sheep. And the Democrats, meanwhile, are obsessed with accumulations of too much power by corporations and aristocrats. And the Republicans are obsessed with the accumulation of too much power and influence by pushy academics and faceless government bureaucrats. And gee, when have governments and aristocrats ever oppressed the people?
Hour and a quarter, hour and 20.
Oh, okay.
So we actually have another 20,
Yeah, oh, okay.
15, 20 minutes.
Well, I've just been reminded we actually have about 20 minutes more, so. I was thinking we had an hour, so.
My bladder.
Okay, we got lots of people here. Gentleman with the red hair.
Most of your sci-fi novels deal with some hero with a gun, and he's got a cybernetic guy and a lizard sidekick and what have you. 50 years from now, what is just some mundane... some guy with, a guy who goes to work every day, sits at a desk and pushes a pencil. What is his day going to be like?
Nice question.
In 50 years? In 50 years.
Probably be at home.
Pencils will be hard to find.
I think he'll be sitting on the freeway, despite what everything he's doing.
I think that the main thing that's going to be at work here is the haves are going to be people that are computer literate, the have-nots are going to be people that are not computer literate, and the have-nots are going to be helping the haves on with their coats and cleaning up their houses, and I really think that a servant class is going to come back, because they're going to have a choice between staying home and watching television and collecting whatever tiny little dole that people want to give them for jobs or actually going into service industries.
It will be mobile, this servant class. We who use computers, we have the missionary, or somebody's helping me on with my coat. I want to teach him how to use my computer. And then he's off.
Well, that's great, because that repudiates the Blade Runner mythos, because otherwise we have Blade Runner and we're dead. Because the guys handing on the coats will rationalize class warfare, and they'll be able to make Timothy McVeigh look like pikers. Fact of the matter is, we have to, and I think we should mention this now, there's a guy here in San Diego who refreshed and restored to vibrancy an old idea and that is the idea of a transcendent singularity. And that is our good friend here, Werner Vinge. And it's created an awful lot of talk. And again, it's the religious thing versus the technological thing, Larry. The old sword of Damocles was we could do nothing about it. The old Terre de Chardin, we're going to expand their consciousness, we could do nothing about. But this will happen because of our computers, because of nanotechnology and all of that. And either we'll create new machines that will surpass us and leave us behind, conceivably squash us like in science fiction scenarios, but why? Or they'll take us along. Or we'll incorporate them and they'll be part of us and we'll simply go along and we'll become, singularity is where you divide a number by 0 and everything becomes unpredictable. Now I give it a good 20% odds, 25% odds that during the next 50 years we will experience this singularity and all bets are off. Either we're gods or we're these skulls that the Terminator steps on in that future world. One way or another, all bets are off.
Can you give an example of what you would consider a singularity?
We all share in a godlike, almost instantaneous fashion almost all human knowledge and are able to leverage our ideas against every idea that everybody else ever had. Thereby, technology skyrockets. Our
Problem is you have to download all the ads first. That's
Gentleman with the glasses and the Hawaiian shirt.
That's
I'm
a
sorry.
limiting case. It's terrific. It's terrific. Have that. No, that is the limiting case. These are the limiting cases for the 50-year projection. And in between, there's a lot of room for discussion.
A friend of mine was speaking with a man who's nearly 100 years old. He asked him what was the biggest change he'd seen in his life, and he said it was the change in the status of women. In the past 50 years, especially the change that we've seen have been in social areas like change in the status of women, in the races, homosexuality, some of these things. For the next 50 years, will we see, can we possibly see comparably large changes in our social relations? And also, will the changes that we've seen in the first world, Western Europe, the English-speaking countries, will these changes ever be pervasive in the third world countries?
Yeah, obviously this was something that was kicked off by the civil rights movement in the 60s and a lot of other things that were happening at the same time. And as much as people are fond of knocking the 60s, you know, that's, I think, one of the paradigm shifts David was talking about, one of those 22-year shifts. There was a sudden realization that we weren't keeping a lot of our promises. And of course, we're still working through that. It's still a political issue, and you know, our governor likes this one, as you know. The relation between the races and the wedge issues and all these things. We're at the beginning of, I think, what is a great social experiment to see if we can actually. And I really do. And here's where I would agree with David on this. I think this is one place where in the next 50 years it's going to be resolved one way or the other. I think that 50 years from now, I'd like to see we've finally gotten our act together, because we're still arguing about this, but I like to tell my students when we discuss this particular aspect of culture, it's been a magnificent change. We're not all the way there yet.
There's a real interesting, I recently saw, there was a documentary about a young black woman talks about the fact that she never knew that her mother was white. Her mother had an interracial affair and given birth to her and then given her away to a black couple. And so this woman kept in touch with her daughter, but it wasn't until her daughter was grown that she was told that this was her real mother. She always, you know, assumed. And so she's talking about, you know, what a change that was, where, you know, when she was born, you know, a white woman did not get together with a black man and did not have an interracial baby, and you know, that sort of thing. But the most interesting comment she makes in her documentary in discussing this thing is that she's talking about, as it were, black awareness and being Afro-American and all the rest like that. She comes to say at one point that she starts to see that the class difference is definitely an economic difference, that she has a whole lot less in common with, there was a point where African Americans had an awful lot in common. They all did, because of civil rights and all the rest like that. But now, now that a lot of the civil rights things have been taken care of, not entirely, but have been taken care of, they have less in common because some of them have money and some of them don't. And the big differences between those who don't have money and those who do have money. And I think that's happening on all levels now. Once you begin to break down the barriers, and again, that they haven't entirely been broken down by any stretch of the imagination, you begin to realize that those who have money have less in common with those who don't have money than they used to have just because they were the same sex or the same race or anything like that.
Well, talking about the interracial marriage, I think probably the ultimate solution to the racial problem it was said by this character in a movie called Bulworth, where the senator said, what we need to do is have sex with each other until we're all the same color. And I suspect that that's probably what's going to actually happen. The United States is really the first world nation. It's hard to name another nation that is as...
Brazil. In Brazil, what race you are depends on how much money you've got, period.
George Carlin, who was one of the great futurists,
mingling.
Yeah.
said that in 50 years, children will ask their dads, gee, Grandpa, is it true when you were a child, dogs couldn't vote? now project another generation later. Gee, Grandpa, is it true when you were a child, computers couldn't vote? 20 years later, gee, Grandpa, is it true that when you were a little transistor, fictional characters couldn't sue their authors? It puts a whole nother color on immortality. It makes you wonder if you want to be thawed out, Larry. If you want to sign up for cryonics, you want to be thawed out in a future in which your characters can file suit against you?
I think Louis Wu has a case.
Louis Wu got sex on stage all over the place.
My characters are reasonable people, despite their damnable sense of humor.
It all depends on whether the background characters get extrapolated.
Oh man, I don't have villains like a lot of authors.
Yes, but you have a
If
lot
my
of people
villains sue me.
who suffered. You have quadrillions who suffered just mentioned in passing. Your foreground
He's
characters
thinking in
like
constant mood.
Yeah, well, your foreground characters like the hell out of you. You give them sex on stage.
There's a gentleman who's holding a bottle of water over there.